This is a King County-wide problem and a Puget Sound regional problem, not just a Seattle issue.
In January, a new authority takes a lead role fighting a crisis on our streets.
Would you guys be interested in something like that?
The RHA wants to focus on downtown Seattle right away, but there's a request for extra funding too.
What do we have to show for the money that we put into it already?
Can the authority get support from business leaders, philanthropists, and city governments who may have some different views?
Absolutely, we want to be part of the process.
I think that this community has the resources and the will to get this done.
We're one-on-one with the new CEO of the Regional Homelessness Authority.
This budget is not sufficient.
Can a new centralized approach solve a decades-old problem? Find out next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. The new King County Regional Homelessness Authority in January takes control of a crisis that's been a declared emergency for the past 6 years. The RHA will coordinate resources, services, and housing options throughout the county, but those are far from the only challenges. There's pushback from some local governments, tough questions from business leaders, and even a clash with Seattle's plans to build more tiny house villages. This week, we're examining the new Homelessness Authority, whose actual authority faces a huge test with a cold winter and the end of Seattle's eviction moratorium fast approaching. Kirk McClain's workplace is a short walk through Magnuson Park to a supportive housing building in North Seattle. But it's a long way from 2009, when he didn't have a job or a home.
My unemployment benefits ran out, and that was it. I was done, and I found myself on the street.
Kirk was homeless for 5 years, taking classes at Highline College to become a paralegal, often sleeping behind the library. He now helps others find housing as a case manager with the nonprofit Solid Ground, and he's part of the Lived Experience Coalition on the governing board of the new King County RHA, or Regional Homelessness Authority.
We have looked at how Seattle and King County have addressed the homeless situation, and we have seen problems, we've seen shortcomings, we've seen things that need to be changed.
City and county leaders established the RHA in late 2019 to provide better coordination and a more regional approach to homelessness. The COVID pandemic delayed the start of the authority, but beginning in January, the new county-wide system for outreach, services, and housing placement is scheduled to be up and running.
2022 is going to be a little bit of a year of transition.
Seattle City Councilmember Andrew Lewis chairs the council's Homelessness Committee, which approved the transfer of $114 million city dollars into the RHA's coffers this year.
This is a King County-wide problem and a Puget Sound regional problem, not just a Seattle issue.
Granola bar and hygiene kit if you're interested.
The authority plans to use a more personal approach with peer navigators to help people experiencing homelessness get off the street. The RHA says it will not clear out or sweep encampments, leaving that decision to individual cities. Lewis is bullish about the impact the new governing body will have, but the underlying regional need for more shelter spaces presents a glaring problem.
It's not a case of a bunch of people that are choosing to be homeless, refusing to go and access services. It's a case where there's 2.5 times more demand than there is supply of enhanced shelter options for people to get placed into.
We cannot afford failure anymore.
Former Governor Chris Gregoire leads Challenge Seattle, a group of 21 CEOs from our region's top employers, focused on homeless people with the highest needs.
We have no success when it comes to chronic homelessness.
Challenge Seattle says since 2017, the number of chronically homeless people, meaning without a home for a year or more, has increased by 42% per year in King County. And while government spending on homelessness has increased 21% annually during that time, Challenge Seattle says that pays for only half of the services and shelter space needed.
What do we have to show for the money that we put into it already?
The RHA is hoping to involve business groups like Challenge Seattle in a billion-dollar capital campaign to build more emergency housing. Gregoire says the authority needs to enact proven solutions like California's Home Key program if they want support from big corporations.
Yes, it's going to take more resources, but only if we have a plan, we focus on the plan, we execute on the plan, and we're open and transparent to the public at large.
But different cities in King County have different responses to homelessness.
Encamped individuals on our island are becoming bold criminals.
In February, the Mercer Island City Council voted to expand its decades-old camping ban to include all public areas, not just parks.
For 30 years, we've had this on the books in the parks, and we've never once written a citation or arrested anybody, but we've used it to get people connected to resources.
While many advocates blasted the city's decision, Holmes says Mercer Island's lack of services means officers are the ones who deal with encampments and try to connect people with shelter.
And that's been our goal all along.
Holmes says Mercer Island is working on agreements with 2 East Side shelters to encourage referrals and fund services. The type of collaborative effort, he says, needs to happen countywide.
This issue of people who experience homelessness, it's not defined by jurisdictional boundaries, so this is a regional issue that we have to be partners in.
It's a regional issue, with a new attempt at a regional solution via the RHA. Kirk McClain says transitioning to the authority will test local governments across the county to rally around a new answer for homelessness that's desperately needed.
It's always going to be challenged by people who don't like the KCHRA or how we're doing things, but I think overall, we've got the political will to make the changes that are necessary.
And joining us to discuss these issues further, we have with us Marc Dones. They are the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Marc, really good to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I want to start by asking what your role is as the new leader of a new agency, the RHA. You describe it as chief cat herder in an interview with The Times earlier this year. I want to talk about what this job is and what it is not, because a lot of people in our region are looking to you to solve some pretty big problems.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. The reason I call my job chief cat herder is because I think that, there are a lot of different ways to do any job. I think of my job as bringing people together and bringing them along, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that we solve complex community problems by fiat. I don't think we solve complex community problems by sort of running roughshod over each other. Mm-hmm. We do it by coming together. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what I focus on in my day-to-day is the mechanics of that, right? Like the mechanics of bringing people together, of making sure that we have the right connections, the right information, that we're able to, really have a sense of what's happening on the ground, what's happening to people, and also, right, like how that is impacting the communities across the region, right? I think that, oftentimes we think about homelessness, we see downtown Seattle in our heads, but there are 39 cities, right, in this county. People are experiencing homelessness in every single one of them, and it actually does look different. And the people who are doing the work to ensure that those folks have their needs met and can get housed again are all doing that with different resources, different literal, terrain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And looking at that, just some of the nuts and bolts of it, Marc, you're renegotiating contracts with service providers, et cetera. Can you talk about that too? How's that going? I know there's a lot to coordinate there.
Yeah. Fortunately, I have a really growing and very good team. And so, I am not personally having to renegotiate all those contracts.
Okay. Okay. I know it's a lot of work. Yeah.
I think it's going well. I mean, yeah, it is. It's over 200 contracts. And that is the contracts that come from the city of Seattle and the county. As we start to bring in contracts that are sitting again with those other 38 cities, the number will grow. Okay. But I think it's going well. Our chief program officer, Peter Lynn, and his team, led by our grants manager, Carol Mizuguchi, are doing incredible work. And I had the privilege of being on a provider call yesterday where we were talking about the rollout of the new 22 contracts, what's that going to look like, et cetera. And, you know, it is complex work. It is, you know, it's not sexy, right? Like administrative work is not like the stuff that people get up in the morning and are like, oh, like, you know, that's the thing, right? That's going to end homelessness. But it's
check done, right?
And so we are fortunate enough to have a good team that is leading that work. And you know, one thing that I will say is, you know, one of the things we're trying to do is really modernize some of it. And, you know, I think that's one of the hopes that people had for the authority, right? That we
make it more transparent and more accountable. Sure. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, you know, some of just the way that we are doing our grants management, I think is going to look different for people and, you know, frankly, produce different, to your point, data availability and be able to say, you know, sort of what money is going where and why.
Okay, I can't wait to do that story about the HMIS in the near future here. So we'll come back on that data piece, I know, later on, Marc. I want to put out a piece here just focusing on downtown Seattle, because that really seems like your first order of business here. You've got a plan for this. You're prioritizing that area. I want to talk about why you're doing that, what you're proposing, and also how you'd pay for it, especially because as we're recording the show in mid-November, you probably saw it recently, it doesn't appear the City Council is fully supporting this plan in its budget. Let's try to break this down, Marc.
Yeah, you know, so the reason why we are focused on downtown is because of the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness downtown, right? And I want to be really clear about that, because I think that there are times in, again, sort of the community conversation and narrative, folks have suggested it's because of business or, you know, because of other reasons. And the bottom line is that when we look at the data, the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness downtown, in the downtown corridor, in a semi-permanent way, meaning like that is where they live, right? Is higher than the other sort of main Seattle neighborhoods. And again,
makes
just
sense.
look at it in that way. And the reason for that is because there's been a density of services cited here. And right, like when people are released from King County Correctional Facility, from Harborview, right? This is where they wind up. And so there are these literal pulls into the downtown corridor, and then people don't really have a path back out. So, you know, that is the reason why we have selected downtown as our first core area of operations. I also want to note, right, that just like in terms of like the theory behind it, I think it's important to be transparent, right? To your point about budget, the first thing I will say is like this budget is not sufficient, right? And so we have or, you know, frankly, this is on me at this point, right? Like I have the option of continuing a trend of trying to be everywhere at once, or saying we actually don't have we don't have the capacity to do that, right? And so for us, I think we have said, let's do place-based work and have areas of focus. And in those areas of focus, let's expect dramatic results and be clear about where we're focused and why, right? So that's the underlying theory there. In terms of, you know, the promises and, you know, what we think is possible, I am committed, like firmly committed, not to being, you know, this community's snake oil salesman, right? I never tell you that a thing is possible when it is not. And so based on whatever the final budget allocation is, I will then come out and say, this is what we think we can do. But I will not, you know, sort of, I think, frankly, continue a trend in our field. This is not about this community. This is about like a field-wide
everywhere.
thing. Where we say, we can do it on, you know, a shoestring and two sticks of bubble gum, right? And that's just not true, right? And so, you know, when the final budget is signed into law, we will evaluate the funding allocation, and we will tell people based on that what we think is possible.
I want to come back to that issue in just a second, but there's one piece of this I think is really interesting. With this plan you're talking about here, you've talked about putting together a high acuity shelter for people who really have some stark needs there when it comes to behavioral health, when it comes to addiction, things like that. Also some peer navigation going on. I wanted to talk about the shelter in particular because it sounds like you would like that not to be in downtown property, like other neighborhoods kind of be involved with this. I wanted to talk about that, why you want that to happen, and also just this idea of where would you put something like that? Can you find a neighborhood that would welcome something like that?
Yeah, I think this is, I really welcome this question because it allows me to clarify a couple things. One, our vision for high acuity shelter beds was never one giant facility, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we think that would be an inappropriate return to, frankly, like the psychiatric hospitals of the 1950s, right? Which we shut down because for good reason, right? Like it is very difficult to manage that level of intensity in a humane way and like centering people's dignity.
Yep.
So we really always anticipated that the high acuity shelter beds would be split up and layered into existing sites that had capacity from a rooms perspective.
Okay.
Or layered into new sites that might be brought online.
Okay.
And to the point about other neighborhoods, this is a place where, I'm grateful that we're a countywide agency, because for us, it's not just about other neighborhoods in Seattle, it's about other jurisdictions, right? We think that there are places to site these high acuity beds countywide, right? That allow us to get to that total number of 150 that we were aiming for. And again, not concentrate it all in one place.
Got it.
I will say that, to the extent of the sort of like, would any neighborhood welcome this? I think of it as, do neighborhoods welcome hospitals? Like, right? Like we are talking about citing infrastructure that cares for people, right? And so I think the conversation around the sheltering of folks who are in need has become, as most parts of this conversation have become, frankly, really polarized and really toxic. And I think we need to take a step back and really sort of bring ourselves back to basics, right?
Right.
I think that what people, when they say, I'm concerned about the shelter in my neighborhood, what I hear them saying very frequently is, well, what about people who get kicked out? Or what about people, and then they're just going to be in my neighborhood, right? And, I hear that, and I actually think that there is validity there, because, were we saying, we're going to take people who have pretty significant needs and move them from a street downtown to a street in Kirkland, right? That isn't helping anybody, right? That's bad. But that's not what we're saying, right? And particularly for this high acuity shelter, part of the reason why we think that this is necessary is many of the people who do wind up back outside from experiences in shelter are this group, right? Folks whose behaviors, because they have psychotic spectrum illnesses, or significant substance use or co-occurring disorders, right? Those behaviors cannot be well managed in typical shelter settings, right? The staffing just isn't there to do that. So what we're saying actually is that's a valid concern. And the answer is not to not allow shelters to site places. The answer is to build a shelter environment that is enriched with the right level of service to make sure that people don't have to go back outside.
Got it. Thank you for breaking that down. I want to touch on a piece that you hinted at earlier here, just looking at our recent elections. For the most part, more moderate candidates, ones who were talking about keeping our public spaces clear of encampments, were the ones who got elected. Mayor-elect Harold told me he doesn't think we need new revenue to deal with the homelessness crisis. I want to talk about these different political stances. I know you've heard them too. How do those align with your vision of the RHA and what you're trying to do?
I mean, I think, on the revenue question, I will say, I think Mayor-elect Harold is clear, and I've heard him say this, right, that more money is needed. He thinks, my understanding, based on what I've heard him say, is that we don't necessarily need taxes to get that revenue, right?
Okay.
And I, frankly, right, like, from my perspective, so long as we're saying that we're going to put more money into the work, I don't actually care.
Right. You're talking about potentially businesses, philanthropy, some other options there. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And if Mayor-elect Harold, right, wants to spearhead a community effort to raise that capital, in a way that is not taxation, then I will be fully in support of that, right, and do whatever I can to lift up the assets that this agency could provide, that he would need to do that work.
Okay.
I will say that, like, on the again, from a polarization standpoint, with regard to the conversation about public space, right? Like,
please,
that I really want to make sure that people hear directly from me every time I have the opportunity to say it is, no one is actually wrong here, right? Like, this is a situation where we have, we're so in pursuit of heroes and villains in this story, and neither, like, those don't exist, right? And the reality is that, I'm a psychiatric anthropologist. That's my degree. I know how to de-escalate someone who's having a psychotic episode. Like, I know how, like, that's the thing I went to school for, right?
Right.
I don't think that it is reasonable to expect people to know how to do that in order to go buy milk.
Okay.
I also don't think that people who are suffering from psychotic spectrum illnesses should have to live outside. These two things are true together, right?
Okay.
And so, like, absolutely, we should be able to access public space in a way that doesn't require us, right?
Yeah.
To do that work of having to be all trained in various forms of de-escalation crisis management.
Well, can I jump in super quick, Marc, just on this? I want to try to put a finer point on it. It doesn't sound like the RHA specifically would be working on anything like a sweep, as they're called here in Seattle here, but cities would kind of take care of that. I mean, sometimes there are public safety issues with these encampments, and I know those need to be taken care of. Can you walk me through what that's going to look like when the RHA is in charge?
Sure. So we're working right now actually on developing a much finer tuned and frankly concrete and transparent set of policies around how we engage and support people who are living encamped outside, right? And I think what that is gonna look like for us is, to your point, there are public safety issues, right? Like, there are incidents where there are shootings, there are incidents where there are, stabbings. There are also very clearly incidents where, there are tents that are being used for criminal activity.
Rackets,
and no one actually lives in it, right?
Right.
In camouflaged in the encampment.
They'll put stolen goods in there, etc. Yes.
So, those kinds of things, like, we are not a public safety agency. So in those instances, right, like, what we are working on is a way of determining when our job is done, right? Because the services and the supports that we could provide to people are, in place. We've done what we can do. Or, right, like, when we identify, like, actually, there's a lot going on here that is a significant enough public safety concern that a public safety agency, right, should respond to it. I think the other thing that we will say early on, right, is that our vision, what we're trying to get to, is a place where, again, there's a really clear way of determining, right, like, which encampments need which responses in what order, right?
Right.
So that if somebody calls us, right, and says, "Hey, I see this," right?
What do we do about it?
We A, know about it in advance, I hope, and B, are able to say, thanks for letting us know.
Right.
We'll add that to the evaluative criteria that we are using, and we can transparently tell you what's going to happen or not.
Got it. I want to move on to another piece here, talking about connecting with all 39 cities in King County here and getting their buy-in on the RHA. I think about places like Bellevue, Renton, several others who opted out of the county's health through housing program for permanent supportive housing last year, kept that tax revenue for themselves. When you see that go it alone approach, and when the RHA starts looking at sub-regional plans for different areas there, does that take the teeth out of the collective effort on homelessness that I know you're trying to lead? When cities don't play along, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think that, the level of trust, right, in our region around this issue is incredibly low. I'm not going to place blame for that. That's just the situation that I'm sort of stepping into, right? But I do think that we have had, so I started in April, right, late April. in the 6 months I've been on the job, I feel like we've had some very productive conversations with
Yeah.
some of the communities, right? And we were out in Bellevue about a week and a half ago doing a tour with the deputy city manager, and
Okay.
looking at all the services and the good work that they're doing there.
Right.
And so I think that the reality is that people were waiting to see what this was going to be like, right?
Mm-hmm.
And waiting to see if the team that came into the authority was going to be more of a like sort of my way or the highway team, or focused on consensus building, focused on how do we do what we want to do together.
Yeah.
And I think they're seeing that we are the latter, and
Yeah.
and that trust is starting to enter the picture.
That's good to hear. I want to talk about another piece of this, Mark. For our setup piece for this show, we talked to the police chief on Mercer Island, which has a law in the books that says you can't camp in parks or public property. Now, the chief told me there have been no arrests under this ordinance, but he said having that law gives police a pathway to talk to people experiencing homelessness and get them to services. I want to talk about that approach, and really, where do police and sheriff's officers fit into your plans on homelessness?
I think this is a really great question. And I think that it's, for Seattle, right? Like, we often have this conversation in the sort of SPD space, but I really like that you cited it in Mercer first, because what I would say is that, frankly, for some of our smaller, more rural communities, our North Bends, our Snoqualmies, right? Like the whether you like it or not, and I'm going to be really clear, right? Like, because it's not about having an opinion on policing. It is about the reality of the situation, that those are the folks, right, who are interacting with unsheltered folks experiencing homelessness. They do not have these, very complex, outreach and navigation.
Right. Don't have those systems, right?
Exactly. Like they have, the 10 police officers.
They got cops,
exactly, who are routinely interacting with folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So I think that I just want to lift that up because the context really matters here in terms of like literally where we are.
Okay.
My thought about that specific law is, I will say, like, my policy opinion is that I don't think you say to me there have been no arrests made. That to me says, like, then maybe you don't need it, right? Like,
okay,
because like there is like the I think the idea, and I can see the logic, right? Of like that that law or that ordinance, right, allows you then to have a pathway to have a conversation, because you can walk up to somebody and say, hey, you can't be here, right?
Yeah, right.
But like, I think that conversation is possible without that opener.
I see.
Right?
I see. Okay. All right.
And right, like, so what I am hopeful for, right, is that we can have conversations again with our smaller communities where that is the outreach, right?
Yeah.
Where we're really focused on equipping the folks who are in those conversations with the skills and resources that they need, so that they don't feel like they need those kinds of ordinances. Because ultimately, right, like, the data is very clear that criminalization approaches to homelessness do not yield the kinds of results that we want to see as a community.
Yeah, I gotcha. I want to talk about another piece of this, Mark. You've talked about reaching out to philanthropic partners in the county for possibly $1 billion to build what you're calling bridge housing. I want to talk about what bridge housing is, and do you think that there's enough philanthropic effort out there, business support for something like this, you can make this happen?
So to the first part of the question, bridge housing is, straightforwardly, it is something between shelter and permanency, right? And what we've identified is that, we have shelter options, we have permanency options. We don't really have a whole lot in the middle. We operate a very small transitional housing portfolio, a lot in the vets and youth space, not a lot, also intimate partner violence space, not in other spaces. And so what that means is that if you go into shelter and you get on a wait list, right, for a voucher or an apartment through a housing authority, right?
Yeah.
And that wait list is 5 years long. You don't have anywhere to be, right?
Right.
And so many people, if you are talking to folks in encampments and are learning about what their lives are like, many people, just so that we are dispelling the myths, right? Many folks are employed.
Yeah, right. They're working.
Many folks are on the wait list. They're doing the things they're supposed to do in order to try to access housing.
Sure. Okay.
But they don't have anywhere else to be, right?
Yeah, right.
And so for us, we immediately identified that as a system gap that was unacceptable, right? Like we cannot have a system that tells people wait outside, right? Like we don't have space for you anywhere else.
Right.
So, you know, from my perspective, and I think our team's perspective, the you know, what we begin to look at is the numbers of people who would need that kind of you know, bridge space. And that the math was straightforward, right? To get to the roughly $1 billion.
And you think the appetite for that in the philanthropic business community is there? Do you feel confident about that?
I
just say that because so many plans have come through before. What's different, you know?
No, I hope so. And I think that like, you know, that $1 billion figure has floated above this community in one way or another for the past
you're right.
5-ish years, right?
Sure.
And I think that what's important to hear about that, whether or not it's an investment in bridge housing or an investment in other housing types, is that the bottom line is that we are, and it's why when, you know, folks are like, well, your budget is so big, but we have underspent for 30 years, right? And so the reason why that $1 billion figure floats out there the way that it does is because that is the deficit we are in, right?
Right.
And so, you know, if you're $100 in debt and you know, pay down $5, you are now $5 in debt.
I got you. Okay.
That's what we often do with our budgets, where we're like, well, we're going to add $10 million. Okay. We're still $1 billion behind.
Right. Okay. I want to talk about another piece of the housing puzzle here, if I could, with you, Marc. The city of Seattle planning to build more tiny houses over the next year here. Councilmember Andrew Lewis has this plan called It Takes a Village to build 12 of them, at least one in every city council district. Now, these houses have had some success in getting people into more permanent housing, but I know you've raised some red flags about the expansion of tiny house villages. What are your concerns about that?
My concerns are twofold. One, you know, I think that we need to be focused on the menu of options that gets people inside. Anytime we over-index a system on one thing, it you know, it's like the investment wisdom, right? Of like, you don't put your whole portfolio in one thing, right?
Spread the peanut butter a little more evenly. Okay.
Yeah. So there are a lot of other non-congregate shelter types that can be effective for people. We've seen that, frankly, during the pandemic with some of the hotel motel strategies, et cetera, right? Okay. So like my pushback on that scaling, right? And I want to be really clear, because it's not, some of this has been misinterpreted as like the authority does not support tiny homes. That is not correct. It is the scaling of them at that level that we have, to your point, raised some red flags about.
Sure.
Other component, and part of why those red flags exist for us, is that some of the lengths of stay in those tiny homes are very long.
Yeah, year plus, sure.
And so like, and it raises, you know, concerns for us about whether or not we are able to get people into housing, right? That like all shelter should be oriented towards transitions into some form of housing, right?
Sure, right.
And some of those lengths of stay are very long. And I want to be clear, right? Like, because again, I just finished talking about, you know, the bridge housing need. So it could very well be that like there's not enough of exit pathways, right?
Sure. Okay.
But I think we need to do a deeper dive there, really understand why that is the way that it is before we talk about you know, any kind of increase.
I want to touch on one more issue with you, Marc, before we wrap up here, because we're tight on time here. I want to talk about the city of Seattle's eviction moratorium, set to end on January 15th, just a few days after Mayor-elect Harrell would be sworn in. You still have thousands of people behind on rent in our region. You got some landlords who haven't received any rent in almost 2 years. Do you have any advice for Mayor-elect Harrell? Should that moratorium be extended again? Any thoughts on that?
You know, my straightforward opinion is we have to extend the moratorium, and we have to, and when the moratorium is extended, this is the key thing that I do not feel we have had the, frankly, national support to do. We need to know how many people are behind. Like, we don't have clear insight into that number, right?
Okay.
And so, like, there are estimates, but like,
Yes.
we have no idea if the moratorium evaporated, how many people would show up at the doorsteps of our system the next day,
Yes.
right?
Right.
So we can't even calibrate and prepare for it, right?
Okay.
So from my perspective, we need to extend the moratorium, and we need to begin to understand how many people need our help.
Yeah.
We need to, sort of work to, and the county is working day and night to do this, right? To get that rental assistance out the door, to make sure that we are connecting as many people as we can to that resource so they can stay housed. But, as, from our system's perspective, if we don't even know how many people might come at us on January 20th, right?
Yeah.
We can't prepare for it. And my suspicion is we would drown in it, right? Like we would not be able to provide the help that people need.
Okay, got it. I need to wrap up with you here, Marc, and I really appreciate going back and forth on this. Final question here. You have talked a lot about the urgency of your work with the RHA, and in terms of your success, you have said there's no path to that not happening. So I want to talk about our region's homelessness crisis. What's it going to look like after the RHA is in place for 3 months? What does it look like after a year? What can you tell us about that?
Well, we've been around for 3 months, but
yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
I will say that 3 months, like March of next year, right? After we've had
right. Okay. All right. Fair. Yeah.
I think that the conversation that we'll be having is, what does a fully redesigned system actually look like, right? Because the authority is a vehicle, but we like the redesigning of the system, that work still needs to be done in a down to the program level way. And we need to work with people experiencing homelessness and providers to do that work. And that's really going to be the work of the first quarter of next year. And so I think that in that sort of March, April timeframe is when you'll start seeing this is what's on the table for, the fully redesigned system that we're going to, bid out and then implement in 23. Yeah. A year in, right? My hope, and this is, again, budget dependent, but my hope is that we have successfully gotten to sort of what's called functional zero, right? Which is basically meaning we get everybody inside for at least the downtown corridor, if not that and another neighborhood, right? Yeah. I also would add to that I hope that we have at least 4 or 5 other communities who've decided to join the ILA, right? Yeah. And say formally, like this is where we're going to put our effort. I think those would be the big things that I would look for a year out.
Got it. Putting a coda on this one, I know some people have called this an impossible job. Did you see it this way, the role that you have?
No, I mean, like to be honest, right? Like, much has been made of my job being impossible. Much has also been made of me being young. My perspective is like, I've frankly hedged my bets in my career to do the thing, like, right? Like I try not to take on things I can't do.
Right.
Like
you helped establish the structure that the RHA was built on, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this community has the resources and the will to get this done. We just needed the vehicle. And I think the authority can be that vehicle. And, so for me, it's not like, I don't view the job as impossible because I think the community is behind getting the work done, right? This is not a one-person job. This is the vehicle for, again, community will. And I would say it was impossible if, I guess going back to the question you asked about the election, no matter which way you slice or dice it, whoever you grabbed on the street and said, hey, what do you care about, right? The answer was, I just think people shouldn't have to live outside.
Yeah, right.
And what strategies it will take to get folks inside. That's not like people don't like, they're not in the weeds like that. They are very clear though, that like people shouldn't have to live outside, and they would like to see government really do our job to make sure that is not happening. Right.
Got it.
And so I think that community will is so clear and present. And so this job is very doable.
All right. Great. Marc, a pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. You bet. And we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about the new King County Regional Homelessness Authority? One writes, Seattle needs housing and it needs parks. Because of insufficient willpower and funding at all levels of government, it has neither. Another comments, we thank local leaders for taking a critical first step to reducing homelessness by agreeing to form the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next time, dealing with a rise in mental health emergency calls. Will Seattle's evolving crisis response system and a new state hotline help? That's on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.